Alrighty, here we are, and it's time to get started. Today I want to show you guys a really cool setup that I've been using with my clients who struggle with active and passive hip flexion. We know that most people, especially endurance athletes, are going to suck at producing relative motion when it comes to hip flexion, whether it's passively or we ask them to do it actively. We know a lot of people have weak hip flexors, or when people try to train the hip flexors, you're going to find that one of the things that the body loves to do is it loves to use spinal flexion as kind of a cheat or compensation. What do I mean by that? When most people are going to train active hip flexion, they're going to use a position on the ground. It's great, it's awesome, you should continue to use these. But what we have to understand is that can be very difficult for 99% of people, or it can actually make them think that they're getting forward progress when in fact they're working more spinal flexion compression than actual relative hip flexion. So let me show you what that looks like. When most people go to train active hip flexion, they'll get on the floor and they'll put their legs out, and you'll see they will do lifts like this, and it's awesome. But what you're going to find most of the time, and if you've coached people who have weak active hip flexion or just tight hips, what you're going to find is when they go to flex their hip, so when they go to lift their hip, I want you guys to watch my back, they poke their back out. So one more time, they lift the hip, and right when they lift the hip, they flex their spine or kind of roll back. Now, that's not wrong. You're not going to get injured. It's just that we're not getting relative motion where the femur is moving independently of the pelvis and the low back. Now, what's also happening is the abdominals, the rectus abdominis, is kind of stealing all the force and the load from the hip flexors. Whatever gets loaded first gets most of the load, or generally steals most of it. So that means if the hip flexors kind of get in after the abs, it's almost like there's nothing left over. It's like if you had a bunch of dogs and you put out dog food, whichever dog gets there first is going to snarf up most of it, and then there's not left for anything left for the others. So what I've been using with my clients has been this setup behind me, and I'm going to show you why I think it's awesome. Most people don't have 90 degrees of passive or active hip flexion. And when we're sitting on the ground, the hip flexors not only have to deal with the spine, they have to deal with the hips, they also have to deal with gravity. So we call this a gravity neutral position, where gravity is not helping me and it's not hurting me. If I stand up and I Jefferson curl, that's a gravity assisted position, which means that gravity is my friend, not my foe. When we're on the ground, we're asking a lot of our hip flexors. And most our clients don't have a background in dance or gymnastics or martial arts. If they do, they're going to be very successful at being able to find their hip flexors, manipulate their pelvis, and avoid using too much spinal compression and abdominal contraction. So that is a lot of talking, but I've got to make sure you guys understand the why behind this setup. It's simply to make sure that we get true hip flexion rather than just rolling back into spinal compression and low back flexion. So we're going to set up on a decline bench. And the great thing about this is instead of trying to bring our leg up to us, we're bringing ourselves to our leg. And this is a great setup because you can find kind of the differences between the two sides, and you don't have to deal with gravity as much. So if I go here and I stick my foot on the bottom part of the bench, and then I stick my hip bone, so you want to feel your sit bone on the bench, now I've got easy access to training this leg. There's a couple awesome things. Number one, this free leg. So if you do this like where you have your leg on the box, like this, you're going to get really tired in the other leg standing. So the nice thing about here is since I can rest my butt, I really can spend a long time in the stretch, which we know when it comes to building connective tissue and tolerance to stretch, we need to stay in it. So I don't have any props today outside of this spear, but picture this as a PVC pipe. Picture I've got a squat rack next to me. You generally want to have something that some people can grab with their hands. Now, in this position, we can start to teach people that to find clean hip flexion, we don't simply want to round and down to fake hip flexion. We want to teach people how to use their pelvis, and we want to focus on positions before glory, which is what one of my friends, Range of Strength, talks about. So what I teach people is, let's first work on staying as tall as we can. And then I teach people that as I bow and hinge forward, I want you to get taller. So if you simply say, hey, hinge your hips, people instantly get shorter and smaller, and then we're running away from true hip flexion. But if I tell people, hey, when you're here, I want you to get as tall as you can. So I want you to get your belly button as far away from the ground as you can. Hands on your belly button. I want you to get your belly button as far away from the ground as you can. And as you bow over, I want you to get further away from the ground, and I want you to get taller. So watch the difference. If I simply rounded down, that's not wrong. We're just running away from the stretch. So get your belly button as tall as possible. Keep it as tall as possible. Now as you bow forward, keep it tall and get your spine longer. Boom. Now, I just raced a couple days ago and my legs are sore, smashed, and trashed. So this is a great example of what you'll see. This position is for people who are tight and suck at mobility. So I'm a perfect example today because I'm so sore in my calves and hamstrings that if I rounded down, not much stretch. If I go here, if I raise my belly button as high off the ground as possible, and then as I bow forward, my spine gets taller, not shorter, boom, there's my stretch. Now, when it comes to getting stronger versus being a passive weakling, we're going to have either our squat rack, we're going to have our bars, and then I'm going to teach people how to drive their heel down into the bench. Now, if I'm training the person during the session, I'm actually going to physically try to lift their foot off the bench, and I say, hey, don't let me lift your foot off the bench. And they're going to hold here, they're going to hold here, they're going to hold here. And then when it comes time to train the hip flexor, you guys remember how before people are going to just press their lumbar back, compress the abs, and run away from the hip flexor. Here, since I've got a little bit of a decline, I have a longer runway, I can simply tell people, get your belly button further from the ground, pause, squeeze, lift. Now, that ain't much, but it's honest work. And the great thing about that is the fact that you're not faking active hip flexion with lumbar flexion or spinal compression. Once again, you're not going to get hurt, you're not going to get injured, but a lot of people never progress at their active hip flexion because they're cheating. So as they do their hip flexor work on the ground in straddle or pancake, they simply just get better at compressing, which is an awesome skill. We do need that. And if you're doing your Jefferson curls, you do need compression. But to get better at active hip flexion, I can be here. And like I said, if someone's struggling, all I do is I move my torso to adjust. So if someone can't get a clean lift, boom. And notice how there's nothing happening in my lumbar, boom. And then as I improve, instead of losing my pelvic position, I just hinge over and I keep my belly button tall, and obviously there would be devastating. So this decline bench is a magical setup. I've been using it with my clients, especially all of those who suck at active hip flexion, which is basically everyone. This is awesome. Getting people on the ground is not your best solution for most people. Most people have terrible passive and active range of motion. They can't find relative hip flexion and relative motion. So when they go to flex the hip, they're going to just dump everything together. So I want you guys to experiment with this setup, and I think that you're going to be like, man, why haven't I thought of this? Because it's so simple, and you can do a bajillion exercises from it. So I really hope you guys like this. If you did, drop a like, comment, or share, and that's how we get starched.